Kyle here from allmediareviews.blogspot.com. Please subscribe if you haven't subscribed. Really appreciate it if you subscribe. Thank the people that have recently subscribed. All right, this is the big top 10 video of this long epic marathon. A couple of quick announcements though. I plan to do an artist list, which is not going to be 200 long or 100. I'll probably end up being, it might be close to 100, more like 75. I don't know. And then I do have plans to do a bunch of other things. One of the other things is to talk about metal. I might just do it as prog metal. I'm not sure. I might do it in prog metal album. I might just do prog metal, prog and extreme metal, prog extreme experimental metal or art metal albums list, just to kind of give it a little larger scope. So I mean, it's a little different than this list, which I didn't include any quote-unquote neo-prog or third-wave prog, which people are saying now the Brixton stuff is third wave, which is, by my count, would be more like the fifth wave. You had the original, stuff from the 60s and 70s. Then you had the 80s stuff. I guess Marillion and the that British, especially neo-prog, would be the second wave. The third wave would be more like stuff that started in the 90s, like Anglagard and Echolin, and of course Spock Spirit and the Flower Kings, and it's more retro sounding. And I guess I probably would attach a lot of the quote unquote retro sounding prog of the early part of the 2000s into that, with Transatlantic, Beard Fish, and those likes. And then I would say this is, if you want to say that the whole sequence of things, this stuff would be like the fourth wave. Now, if you're talking about the Brixton stuff, the fourth wave is this art rock, what I call, and then you add post and math and progressive pop and other kinds of styles. The fifth wave of this Brixton stuff is fifth. That's combining not even post rock; it's more like post punk, if it is. But anyway, with the metal list, I think I may end up just blowing it off. I don't know. I'm gonna have to figure out what goes where, because there's definitely a significant difference between, your traditional prog metal, your Dream Theaters or Shadow Galleries, and something like Sicketh or Maudlin of the Well. So I don't know. I'll have to figure it out. It's gonna be based on numbers partly, but so anyway, here's the big top 10. These are the cream of the crop for me, although, again, this whole list is splitting hairs. You could just call this list the splitting of the hairs of, fourth wave progressive rock. So, number 10, Ben Sinister, their finest record, or my favorite record still. I'll quote from 2008, Stories of Brothers and Tales of Lovers. What Dan Moxon wrote on MySpace at the time, 2008. It's like, we always like listening to albums that, all at once, that, you want to listen to the whole thing at once. That's what it really was the goal to try to do with this record. And I always remember this record most from being like, I was really into them. That EP that had come out in 2007, the self-titled, that had Time Breaks Down and so many other great tracks. And the Through the Broken City, of course, the debut album in effect from 2005. So I was really excited to hear anything new, but they were quiet. They didn't post anything for a long time. And something like, hey, we have a new album. It's a full albums that you want to listen to at once, and etc. So this is their most probably classic rock influence styled album. There's a lot of classic rock influence in Ben Sinister. The previous full length album, Through the Broken City, had a lot of Queen elements, but also had a lot of sort of Mars Volta, and Dan sounded a fair amount like Jeff Buckley at points. On this album, not quite as much. And again, the news, they even go on the song "The News," the opening track. I heard the news today, oh boy, referencing the Beatles, of course, and Sgt. Pepper's, and what am I spacing on? A Day in the Life. So that's a great piece. It opens it up, Brothers of Humankind. There's a lot of sing-along tracks on this album. The same things, big chorus, like a lot of Elton John, a lot of Billy Joel, almost like a Styx element in some of these songs. But I find the biggest thing about this album is that it literally does what Dan basically was saying on MySpace, where it's really one of those albums you get the most out of it when you hear the whole thing beginning to end. If I'm also pointing on highlights, I would I would lean toward Demise, even though that's kind of a dark lyrical song. The piano arrangement is really cool. That Ben Sinister, especially those early records, always had these songs that would lead to these really fun, intricate, almost quirky parts at points. And Demise is no exception. Demise, actually, to be honest, sounds the most like their previous albums, their releases in some ways. I don't know. Dr. Lee's a fun track, kind of a call and response thing. Given to the Night, when they reprise that, you have a female singer on that part. CT, Jimmy Brown. The melodies and the hooks and the energy. It's just there's no flaws. Juliana was actually on the self-titled EP, and I actually think the mix is slightly better on this. I think it's different. I'm not certain about that, but yeah, I love this record. The more I listen to it, the more I just kind of got won over by it. And as much as I love several of their other records, even the previous record I have a very nostalgia soft spot for. This album I just kind of concluded that was a step up in a lot of ways, and it just was it's like 40 minutes of perfection. This album could have been released in the 70s, and it would have just gone right on with like ELO and Queen and some of these other classic records. So, Stories of Brothers, Tales of Lovers from Ben Sister, number 10 on the Progressive Art Rock album list, the Modern Progressive Art Rock album list from 2008. Number 9, the album that, in effect, introduced many people to Casey Crescenzo, and the debut album, another debut album, of course, from the Receiving End of Sirens, the short-lived sort of progressive post-hardcore band with a lot of textures and piano and dynamics and heavy riffs at points and vocal harmonies, especially the vocal harmonies. Of course, Casey Crescenzo was only on this album. He wasn't on the follow-up, which I mentioned a while back, The Earth Sings Me from Me. But this is a trip. When I got into the Deer Hunter, literally I checked out this around the same time as the first Deer Hunter album / mini album, and I actually kind of end up going to this one more. I was surprised, as much as I felt like, well, Casey's the guy, and I'd heard he'd left the band, and I wanted the Deer Hunter sort of, I'm super like excited into them with that first album, Act 1. This thing took the kind of my headphone time more so. This was a super energetic album that, among many records on this list, if I needed like something to listen to with a ton of flow and energy to it and just like sort of goosebump moments, this was it. The production on the cymbals, the mixing is the only issue I've ever had with it, which a lot of records have that, unfortunately. It's sort of they weren't concerned with those cymbals clipping, but regardless of that, I kind of got past it for the most part on some of these records. And this just, oh man, it's just so good. It's so, there's so much, they're throwing everything in the kitchen sink. The layering on this record is just crazy. Casey Crescenzo, while this is really his first proper recording that I know of, they really did. I mean, he did some demos and stuff before this. He had a lot of insight onto really sort of adding little parts, adding little things to the songs. Little vocal effects and everything. I mean, from an arrangement standpoint, there's a lot of songs that are just terrifically arranged. This Armistice is often considered, and I'm probably would agree with it, considered sort of the peak of this record. The vocal harmonies are like Queen or like Sabotage. The layering between the three of them, though, it's not a studio technique as much as just you have Casey, Brendan Brown, and Alex Bars. I believe those three, and maybe the whole band, doing harmonies on that song, and it's just back and forth, the call and response. It's so good. The arrangement is so big. Playing a Prison Break is really catchy. The Rival Cycle. They have these just kind of, these little parts that are just earworms, and you can't get them out of your head. This album is filled with earworm after earworm. Intermission is even nice. It's like a break and very soothing and mesmerizing. Epilogue, Dead Men Tell No Tales. The concept of this album, I'm not certain how much the band themselves, including Casey, consider it a concept album, but I kind of look at it as a concept of, obviously, someone who's breaking out of prison, who's, doing a prison break, escaping, And I always think of the movie, The Story, which is based on the movie that was based on the true story of, I believe, Escape from Alcatraz. I've always wanted to try syncing it up. I always wondered, but there's also like a fictional element. It's like it's therapy, and they're talking about someone who's, going through therapy. This is their therapy to sort of go into like this sort of simulated, virtual, a convict going, getting like they've done on The Outer Limits, and it's a couple other movies and TV shows where they don't actually go anywhere physically, but they mentally are sent somewhere else, and they're there for who knows how long, many years. Twilight Zone had an episode where they didn't do that, but the guy was sent to a planet in a distant space, as part of his prison term. But yeah, I love this. Venona's another favorite. The War of All Against All. The way they kind of repeat some of the vocal lines, and they're kind of, the screaming is there. It's more so on here than on the second record. And their first style is considered post-hardcore. Screaming. I like a lot of bands that use screaming. The screaming just kind of is tolerable. Sometimes it's really good with some metal. When I first heard this, I was repulsed by the screaming. I was like, I hate post-hardcore screaming. It just ruins it. And it just kind of, this was so good. The writing on this album was so good that it really just kind of added to it. It's a little bit like death metal growls. I didn't mind it. And I know Casey did some of it, and before this, Casey didn't really have the mindset to do screaming, but he actually brought that style in to his, initially with a lot of the singing on with the Deer Hunter. It's kind of been diminished. I don't know if completely been eliminated from the Deer Hunter style, but anyway, Between the Heart and Synapse, the really epic 70 whatever it is 4-minute debut album, 70 minutes from the Receiving End of Sirens, or Trios as they're also known, from 2005 at number 9. Number 8, Queen of the Wave, an album that came out of nowhere. I've never even heard of, from the band Pepe Deluxe. Never heard of Pepe Deluxe before this album, that was like being sort of rated really high and championed by some of the sort of hipster pitchfork audience, but also on Rate Your Music here. It was like number 1 and number 2 for a number of months in early 2012. And I was kind of in disbelief, like, is this album really that good? And I listened to it, and I listened to it more and more, and I kind of started to just believe, yeah, this album is really that good. It's not that long. It's very retro, very 60s sounding. It sounds like an album that should have been recorded and written in the 60s. A lot of great bass lines, a lot of guitar, like, surf rock guitar. A lot of great harmonies, a lot of great vocal parts from a bunch of different vocalists and vocal harmonies from different vocalists that Pepe Deluxe uses. Pepe Deluxe are this band from Finland, although they've had members based in other parts of the world, including parts of like New York City. But it's a pop opera, as they call it. It's very creatively done and composed. I mean, my favorite songs, A Night and the Day, Go Supersonic, are like the 1-2 punch. Grave Prophecy, In the Cave. The writers on the first arc, the singer, the male singer, I'm not sure which one it is. Is it James Malmstrom or James Spectrum? But it's on that song and The Storm. Those two sound a fair amount like Frank Sinatra. He'll never, like, it's almost like Major Parkinson's singer sounds like Liam Neeson. One of the main singers from Pepe Deluxe sounds a fair amount, at least on this album and some of the previous records. The new record, not as much, like Frank Sinatra, but in a good way. I mean, he's got that like sort of deep, it's like a deep tenor or baritone. The keyboard and the vintage instrumentation. They use all these vintage instruments on it, but they were able to compose these pieces together. Oh my God, it's really a trip down in the past. It's like you look at the artwork, it looks like a film from the 1950s, early 60s, like not a playbill, but a cinebill or whatever, those little cinema ads you'd see from old school Hollywood. Even the artwork with the woman on the shark is in effect. But it's also like an adventure tale, like in the Amazon, and I've listened to this album probably close to 100 times. It's just so good. There's actually a great electronic element, but it sounds very organic. It does sound vintagey, but it doesn't sound poor vintagey. It just sounds vintagey of that kind of the tonality of that kind of the keyboards, the guitar riffs, the bass lines. it's so well crafted, and they use samples and narratives. Yeah, they kind of just put everything in the kitchen sink into this, and it's just I can never get enough. I've never gotten sick of this record, Queen of the Wave, from Pepe Deluxe. Number 8 on the modern modern retro modern progressive art rock album list. So we're going on to number 7. We have the Deer Hunter, the final Deer Hunter, the top Deer Hunter album, Act 2, The Meaning of and All Things Regarding Misleading. This, and I told this a little bit of the story with the Receiving of a Siren's album, Between the Heart and the Synapse, being introduced to Casey Crescenzo. And this came out a few months after I became a fan. I loved Act 1, but it was not that long of a record. Didn't feel that it was like 38 minutes. But Act 2 was kind of the opposite in a way, is that it was super long and epic. And sometimes it works. Sometimes it is a little overwhelming to try to, appreciate the whole thing without kind of, getting lost in it a little bit or waiting for it. And, I'll admit that initially my favorite track on this was Red Hands. And I would listen to this album all the way through and just want to get to Red Hands at points. But that kind of faded at points. Still love Red Hands a bit, as much as Casey doesn't really care to play it live very much. It's super catchy. It's super orchestral pops, the soaring emotion coming out of his vocal lines. And within the concept, it's kind of a funny, ironic part of the story. So that being said, if that's the number one banger on this album has these other tracks, especially that are multi-part, that are just they're almost like suites. There's multiple suites in effect on it. I would say The Lake and the River is definitely one of them. But the way that the Procession, The Lake and the River, the Oracles and the Delphi Express, and the Church and the Dime flow together. It's like a suite of songs, kind of like Marillion's at that time of the night. Warm-up circles at that time of the night, and Hotel Hobbies at the beginning. Bittersweet. A lot of these songs have grown on me somewhat. Smiling Swine is a great track, or catchy, almost piano-driven Beatles-ish. I've always thought of that song with The Day in the Life in some ways. It's someone in a hotel or an apartment or something, who's being gone after. It's like someone's collecting money from them, or they're going after them. Evicted, Blood of the Rose, Where the Road Parts. Dear Misleading is another super big highlight for me. The organ back and forth, it's the way it comes back and reprises a motif earlier in the album, and it's like the lead character Hunter is finally getting all this stuff off of his chest in this letter, misleading. I don't need you anymore. We were in love. We thought we were in love. We're not anymore. Black Sandy Beaches and Vital Vessels Vindicates. It's sort of not an epilogue, but sort of a coda of sorts. Those two, but they're dreamy. Both of them are dreamy. The chamber element is still here that you had from Act 1. In some ways, it's bigger. A lot of xylophone, a lot of cello. Blood of the Rose uses a little violin part. The vocal harmonies are still there. There's some big Beach Boys moments, although from a percentage standpoint, he did more on Act 1. But yeah, I'll admit that this album, while I loved Act 1, kind of supplanted myself as just a massive fan. And in that sense, I owe so much to this album. This album is kind of like Scenes from Memory, Images and Words for this style. It's one of the, other than maybe Delouse and the Comatorium, it's one of the most influential records in this style, for sure. Especially the last 10 years. This record and the Deer Hunter style, you add Act 4 in there too, but still a lot of people, even though they don't like this, some people don't like this album as much as the Act 4 or some of the later records. And Casey has got issues because I guess recording this album was not exactly easy. There were definitely a lot of hurdles he had to go through. And the weird thing is the misleading demos doesn't really include anything from Act 1, but it's a lot of demos from this stuff. And, there's some really good songs on there that didn't even make it that, longtime fans like myself would die to hear them to record and release, like Camera is one especially. But, it's an epic record. It's 76 minutes. But, it's weird how that year in 2007 and 2006, 2005, the epic records, and even into 2008, were a thing that was sort of in vogue in a way. And I found that the ones that were done then at those lengths seemed to work pretty damn well. Even the Mars Volta's Francis the Mute went on really long, and it felt like more natural to listen to the whole thing and almost more enjoyable than actually just cherry picking and just being nitpicky about length. I confess that the last 10 years, maybe even less, just the last 5 years, there's a lot of records that have been in that range, or not even that long, that have more filler to me. But I mean, some of it just comes down to composition and album structure, and just the quality of the songwriting and the music. And this just it wasn't a debut album, but in some ways it sort of felt like a debut album because he got a lot more visibility. The Deer Hunter did. He was not with the Receding Under Sirens. I don't know if actually when Act 1 came out, I think he was still a member. So this was his primary focus, and it totally worked for a lot of reasons for me and many other fans. Act 2, The Meaning of and All Things Regarding Misleading, from 2007 from the Deer Hunter. I have a huge amount of nostalgia for the summer 2007 especially. It's just like a trip. It's an escape. It's therapy music. So another album that involves, at number 7, number 6, another album that involves Casey Crescenzo, and that was like 95% of the reason why I found it and just checked it out, because I didn't really know that much about the people behind this project and this album, the River Empires at the time. The River Empires still remains my favorite album in the 2010s decades. The one, it's an epilogue. The one album that was released under the name, they put out a single the year after. Or was it 2 years after? I think it was a year after. But Jesse Raborti of Falling Up, and later he did a related project, Gloomcatcher, at the same time as this. And he's got a little bit of a solo career and doing stuff in Hollywood. He's the other one that's been working a little bit in Hollywood with games and stuff and soundtracks like video games, I think. Anyway, this was his bluegrass project, but it was so much more than just bluegrass. Although I like bluegrass music, this is an 80th. You thought that Act 2 is epic and long, and like Francis the Mute and a lot of these other records I've been talking about. This is 88 minutes. It's in effect a double album. This is beyond the bluegrass album, which is really good. There's a lot of just lush, highly tasteful orchestral classical music pieces or arrangements on many of these tracks. But I'll say that's just one side to this, and my go-tos aren't even a lot of those pieces. From that's the River Empires theme, Overture in the Summer, Our Neighbor the Earth. There are some vocals on some of these pieces, but oh man, that they're so rich and so fulfilling. But adding on to that, these little folk rock, progressive folk rock elements in songs like A Toast to the Snake King, Three Tigers, a Dimmer Lux. Dimmer Lux especially uses mandolin. And then the second disc or whatever volume, Witch's Blossom. The Motorbike is like a purely acoustic thing, but it's not orchestral. The Pelican, Theon the Fox is super catchy and energetic. And then the ending is very epic with Marching of the Clocks, very like epic, big piano climax at that. What this is the River Emperors intended to be a 7 or 8, I think it was 7 album sort of cycle of records that Jesse wanted to make, and it is the epilogue album. So it was kind of mapping. A lot of these songs were mapping different parts or volumes or albums that were going to come out after it. It's sort of like a going in reverse order in a way. But he obviously found the funds, the people to help out, the time, the studio recording ability to mix and master and arrange everything to make this what was a double album, which actually I think was supposed to come out at least was talked about coming out at least a year before. Because the MySpace blogs were talking about it for a long time, and people got frustrated. And I was kind of in that vein, but I was such a peripheral, third party, because I really wasn't that familiar with Falling Up in his work. But I wanted to hear about it because Casey Crescenzo was involved with this, and he did some mixing. He sings on, I believe it is, was it Toast to the Snake King? He does a vocal part, kind of a background vocals part. But outside the Cellar is another one I really like. This, it's a record that's a mood record. It does work beginning to end. It doesn't drag. It doesn't dead spots. I listened to it many times all the way through, but at the same time, especially since about 2000, mid 2011. I stopped listening to it regularly because it sort of was an album that I had to obviously have like an hour and a half to listen to, and it's just a it's a mood. The style is kind of in the mood. If I want to listen to bluegrass music, want to listen to something from Kacica Crescenzo or Jesse Raborti. I mean, I could put on Falling Up from Casey. Actually did produce the Fangs record from. So the Falling Up relationship with the relationship that Jesse Raborti had with Kacica Crescenzo. Obviously, it happened previously, and Jesse is a fan of Casey's and the Deer Hunter. He showed up on the Color Spectrum a few years later. It was like the year later actually. So anyway, this was it's a hugely ambitious multi-styled, multi-layered. Sufjan Stevens, you could make a slight comparison to because the ambition of the States project he was doing with all those different instruments and musicians playing on his records. Bands have done that since, like the Family Crest and Typhoon. There's like 25 people in the band, but this really was the primary vision of one guy, Jesse Raborti, and it came out so well. It's just the production is just out of this world. It's pristine. It could get an award for production. Sadly, that we've only had the one song, Five Circles Since, and those 6 or 7 records may never see the light of day. But there was a post a few years ago on Twitter saying, "Don't give up on the River Empires." But it's been 11 plus years now, or 12 plus years actually, be 2023. So who knows? But we'll see. Maybe one more record would be enough. So number 6, The River Empires Epilogue from 2010. It's also based on a story about 2 little kids that find a bottle one day. It's a fictional story that I don't know if he's ever really given. He's written some fiction with some of the other Falling Up albums, but it would be great for him to actually publish any type of book. I could try to come up with my own convoluted story. What it means to be. Anyway, it's very like nature, very foresty. I think of like a little bit like C.S. Lewis's the Chronicles of Narnia with it a little bit too, with kids going off and going to another dimension or something like that. Anyway, or even like where the Wild Things Are in some ways in that sense too. So number 5, Set Sail the Prairie from Caddisfly, of course, the second Caddisfly album in the top 20. And I played this album to death. I promoted it to death for about a year and a half. Heard it back in 2006 because it was supposed to come off that fall, and then they pushed it back. But they shared it with some people. People had found it. It's an album I've listened to well over 100 times. It's the biggest thing I'd say is I got into Caddisfly. I found out about Caddisfly through being a big fan of Dredge. The Dredge fans, there's like a percentage of them, like half of the online Dredge fan base either enjoyed it to loved it to became obsessed with it. This thing is like it's an album about the calendar year, in effect, the seasons in the calendar year. Every song represented in effect 1 month, with different elements also with them, but that's kind of what they were going for in a way, a little bit like the color spectrum from the Deer Hunter, but this was done 4 years before. This, from compare, I only know Buyer Intention, and I was sort of on the fence about them, but the production, the songwriting, the vocal parts, even though Chris Ruff's vocals are at times still hard to sort of understand what he's saying, the vocal melodies still work really well. And his voice just got a little better, I think, with this record, and they just benefit from better production. I think just songwriting maturity, and just, I don't know, there's a lot of things that kind of came together with this record. I have many favorites, but I still, again, it's like many records, my go-tos, first and foremost, has always been Via Real. That song, the sort of the bridge part of it, I guess you'd say, is crazy. It's very crazy, like odd time signatures, crazy kind of layering with the guitars. It's very big, the drum part that builds up to it. And I kind of thought, like I wrote in the blog, I think it was back in 2007, it reminds me of what King's X and like Faith No More were doing in the 90s in some ways. It's crazy good. It's so good. I love the build up in that song. Also the thing with the clay, the cups. I think of Indiana Jones in The Last Crusade when they're choosing the different cup to drink the holy water, and you choose the clay one, not the gold one. Because the gold one's a mirage, the clay one's the real one. Campfire and Empire, those two are super catchy. Lyrically, also very poignant when you do read the lyrics. But Empire especially, it's a pop song that's done so well. The piano part, the uplifting piano part, and the very inspiring. Then at one point, Snowflakes was one of the songs that I kept on enjoying more and more, even though there's like that dynamic, huge dramatic dynamic shift, little classical motif in the middle there. And the guitar riff's probably the heaviest moment on the album, maybe the heaviest that Kacica ever got. Talking about the heart and the mind and all this stuff, and what you think of when you think of winter. After that, Silk Road's another super melodic track that the build up is just inspired. I get goosebumps every time I hear that. That's supposed to represent like some part of East India or something like that. Around whatever February. It's like getting through the seasons, getting through the difficult weather. It's February, you get to March. Forest is a fantastic closer. That's the part where you're getting past winter, really into the springtime and everything. The snow's melting and you get this uplifting feeling. Although they talk about fire, there will be fire, sort of seeing things at the end of the world, foreshadowing what they do with the next record, Horses Galloping on Sailboats. Because this is sort of the middle period of life on Earth, not the beginning and not the end. Harbor and Waves are both really energetic and catchy. They talk about, there's the chorus, I believe it's in Harbor, talking about a boat sinking, Campfire, I love. That was the first single they released. That's really the song that kind of changed my mind about Kacica's Fly, or really sold me. So Mercury and Clockwork, talking about perception of reality and everything. Yeah, Set Sail the Prairie is, even though the term set, you can't sail on a prairie, but Set Sail the Prairie is just a masterwork in modern rock music, really. I know some people didn't go for it because they don't like the vocal style or whatever. Some people compared it a lot to Incubus. I could see it to a point, but it's still more sort of shifty and more creative from being more progressive. It's more conceptual, of course. So anyway, Kacica's Fly from Portland, Oregon. Their name came from the bug, although it's spelled with a C, I guess, the insect. Set Sail the Prairie, number 6, number 5 rather, on the progressive art rock albums list of the modern progressive art rock album. So number 4, Coheed and Cambria. It's become pretty much the landmark, go-to, signature record in their catalog. It wasn't initially by everyone, but this is the album that I first checked them out. I don't know if I had listened to anything from the previous record, In Keeping Secrets, but this kind of hit me over the head with a ton of bricks. This is one of those records that the melodies are so catchy. It's so over the top. And while, this is the rest of their music, the rest of their catalog, I don't even think, is nearly as good. I love In Keeping Secrets, but this is 2 or 3 steps up. It has David Bottrill producing. They just kind of hit on all cylinders with production, songwriting, flow. It has maybe their signature track, Welcome Home. Everyone loves that. Even people that hate the band enjoy that song. Is it metal? I don't know. I guess you could say it's heavy enough to be metal. But it's an epic sort of anthem. It just builds up more and more. My favorite whole part of this, I look at the Willingwell Suite, where they're labeling on here. Jesse, the flow of that is just, it's hook after hook. It's hard not to just get into it and start, feeling the rhythm and just the flow, the energy on all 4 of those parts. It's a trip. It's just a massive progressive rock trip to kind of end the record, actually. Let's see here. The other, I want to name specific. The Suffering's very catchy. It's a pop song, but I still enjoy it. 10 Speed of God's Blood and Burial. I love the hook on that track and the vocal lines. Let's see. I don't know. Mother May I. This record is a sweet. It's like I was saying about Muse and the Glass-Handed Kites. I think of this record in a lot of ways as just track 1 to track 15 is a large suite. The thing is, of course, the title, like not that Mew album, but the one after it, is a mouthful. I just call it Good Apollo 1 because they put out Good Apollo 2 a couple of years later. But and I saw it live, and I got goosebumps. I'm not the biggest Coheed and Cambria fan. I like them, But this record, they just found everything that came together, and Claudio's voice kind of grew on me, and I got more into the previous record because of this. But yeah, it's like perfect, like heavy progressive pop, you could say, or heavy progressive pop rock, you know. Anyway, number 4, Coheed and Cambria, I'm Burning Star 4, Volume 1, From Fear Through the Eyes of Madness. You know, very ego-driven, not pretentious, ego-driven title. So, number 3, an all-time classic. I've mentioned this when I was talking about Blackfield, and, you know, this has been a go-to. Distorted Lullabies, another debut album from Ours, that came out in 2001. Many years in the making. They weren't a new band in the early 2000s. They were a band that formed in the early mid-90s. But, you know, they had major labels going after them in a bidding war trying to sign Jimmy, Necco, and Ours. It finally came out in 2001. I discovered it in 2005 when Mike Portnoy talked about it, and there's another guy named Alfred Packer on the Mike Portnoy forum talked about Ours. The whole Bono on steroids thing. And I'd become a bigger U2 fan the previous years, so that helped. But this is another record that is just song after song just hits you over the head. There's so much emotion and passion behind it. Sometimes was a minor hit, and that's still probably my go-to on this record, but sometimes is massive. So is Fallen Souls. You know, Meet Me in the Tower. I have songs like this, parts of this album in my head frequently. Misery Head is really kind of almost industrial sound at points, a lot of vocal distortion on that one. Medication is like an epic ballad of sorts. Bleed is sad and sort of very kind of Misery Love Company in a lot of ways. Drowning, I'm a Monster also, that, you know, Jimmy basically showcased all his abilities out of the gate on this record. While I love many of the other records that came out, this is still the go-to. It's iconic to me. I know, you know, a lot of people don't care for Ours or check them out and just don't get it or think they're just okay. There's a lot of people that just look at this one record. The whole comparison to Jeff Buckley and, you know, Radiohead and a bunch of other people, you know, Muse, of course, Muse, while they were around at this time, you know, they weren't a band at the time that Jimmy started. But it doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but, you know, whatever. People are going to say what they say. Everyone hears things differently. This is just a special record to me. It came to me at a special time. I mentioned Ari Daniel and the Blackfield thing. You know, this was another record that a lot of the lyrics really hit me over the head, thinking about what happened to her and what was going on. So, Here Is the Light's another highlight on this record. He does that live. There's a dreamy element to this. You know, is it gothic? Is it, you know, does it sound like, you know, sort of 90s alternative rock, which I don't even like the term. I suppose it does in some ways, but just on sheer sort of emotion, passion, and just the scope of the vocal arrangements alone, to me it's very artistic and progressive in some ways. I'd never really heard anything like it, you know, and so that to me is being progressive. So anyway, Ours, number 3, Distorted Lullaby from 2001. And here we go into the top 2. Number 2, the number 1 top Dredge album, El Cielo. I'm from 2002. I think I've mentioned that part of what made this record so great was how it synced up with one of my favorite movies of all time. A movie my wife did not care for at all. But Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, Anthony Green of Circa Survive, and I think the whole band figured this out. I'm not a Circa Survive fan. I don't really like his voice, but so be it. I'll totally credit him for if he was the one who discovered this unique experience of watching that movie with the sound off, like with The Wizard of Oz and The Dark Side of the Moon and some others. Rush's 2112 with Charlie and Chocolate Factory. This album has all these weird syncs up while you watch that movie, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. That being said, I liked it before I did that, but it kind of hit me over the head. Like, this is brilliant to think of, and I think of, you know, it's an album that's a concept album about sleep paralysis. Of course, Eternal Sunshine's about people doing therapy into their sleep, having to erase memories and stuff, but you know, it has a lot of highlights, although it's kind of another one of these sort of masterworks, like a little bit like A Pleasant Shade of Grey. It's better than some of its parts. The last 2 tracks are kind of my favorites. What Was Me, the sax part, the little sample at the end, the guy from the I don't think it's a real radio show, but it sounded like a guy on a radio show, an older guy, DJ talking about that. And then The Canyon Behind Her, which is just epic. It's a closing track they've played in concerts basically since they recorded and released it, even before that, I think. Yeah, it's just so, like, does anybody feel this way? Does anybody feel the way I do? It's relatable, it's therapeutic, it's escapist. there's a lot of other just songs that I enjoy. Convalescent is one of them. The whole build up in that song, the fast picking, and that do. There's some other songs that always remind me. It sounds. I think of like Genesis, Misunderstanding, but I also think of like 50s, American Dream, The House in the Suburbs, the Two and a Half Kids, etc. The white picket fence. But 18 People Living in Harmony. I think that's the one, or that talks about not a white horse, but I think of a horse. I think of the Black Stallion story and movie, and then there's a Jeff Buckley song I also think of in the same kind of vein idea. Triangle, it's very kind of intricate, almost math rocket points. San Zen, same old road. It's a story. It's a very surreal kind of story album of the room. This is almost the definition of using art with music. And of course, this art, this is I believe a Salvador Dali painting, or El Cielo was the name of one. There's a couple different covers actually here for El Cielo. Why is this album higher than some of these other albums? I mean, in terms of how many times I've listened to it, it probably shouldn't be. I just kind of feel like I love Dredge, and I was just in awe of this album after that whole experience with Eternal Sunshine. And then just, I saw the thing live. It just was like, yeah, this is Dredge. This is representing Dredge the most, and this is their sort of creative masterpiece in a way. It's their second album. I mean, is that fair? I don't know. I just think that they kind of, struck gold with this, the follow-up to Leitmotif, which is a good album itself, but I mean, this has a lot more colors. It's very surreal. There's, very trippy, very, you call it, say it hippie-ish. In some ways, yes. Gavin's vocal lines are a little better, a little more colored and emotional at points. They kind of just he became a slightly better singer, to be honest with you. This is a terrific record, and it's always been a go-to for me. My all-time favorite albums ever since getting into it. Whatever it was, 18, 19 years, almost 20 years ago. It was 2000, whatever that was, 2005. So, all right, so we're on to the final album, which I've mentioned ad nauseum on this channel at points. I did a video on them. Of course, it's Apes and Androids' Blood Moon from 2008. The sort of definitive indie-tronica album, big concept album that the guys from previously called Florence Plow, Brian Jacobs and David Tobias worked on with the assistance of Matt Mahaffey at points. It just kind of hit me over the head with a ton of bricks, and I couldn't believe how unusual but how addictive and how inspiring this record, how much of an escapist. Like, El Cielo is an escapist album. There's a lot of albums on this I consider sort of escapist therapy albums. This was my number one, and I couldn't believe how much I enjoyed it. That being said, it has a lot of individual songs which I still go back to, enjoy the energy from. Make Forever Last Forever, Golden Prize, Hot Cathy, We Don't Understand You. That song is a banger, pop banger. If Johnny and Sarah, the guitar solo, that's post-punk at its finest to me, even though it's not of the post-punk era. This is 2000s post-punk, it's not early 80s post-punk. And then Riverside is sort of in a way, the climax of the record. It's very, very uplifting. The concept being, take it what, you can come up with your own concept, but, someone going to this moon, I guess, like a human, and, trying to kind of, live or experience, find life or deal with the circumstances of a society of, life forms being controlled by, other life forms, androids. You could say like cinema's highly influenced this, from Total Recall to Westworld to Blade Runner, especially, among others. I mean, there's just, my fascination with man versus machine, how, artificial intelligence, the sci-fi element is just what puts this over the top too in a lot of ways. I'm a huge sci-fi fan, and the 80s element too. I was a kid of the 80s, like Night of the Comet. While it's not a favorite movie of all time of mine, if I ever do a movies list, which I should at some point, I want to, Night of the Comet would be among, my top 100 movies, or top 50 maybe, especially top 50 sci-fi movies. It's just it's a total escapist album. A lot of albums like the Everything album, Get to Heaven. I love listening to music and getting an escape. It's total therapy for me at times. When you need that escape, you just want to forget about your life. That's what music. That's oftentimes what music at its best does for me. This was mine too. I think that's part of it. Is I felt like, there weren't that many people ever that knew about this band. Yet this wasn't soft second half, lowbrow, low production. This was everything in the kitchen sink. I mean, the influence from David Bowie to Pink Floyd to Thomas Dolby to Sparks to Prince to Guns N' Roses to Metallica to, they had all these influences to Queen. And in fact, Queen is probably the biggest one. These guys could really sing, Brian Jacobs and David Tobias, where a lot of these bands, the similarity to Of Montreal, of course. I never got into Of Montreal. I don't find that Kevin Barnes is nearly the singer that either of those guys, especially Brian Jacobs, is. There's a couple songs on here that sound a little bit like Tom York singing with Radiohead. Was it Locked in a Car? Brian is on a little bit in Imaginary Friends. I don't like Tom York's voice. I've never liked it and never probably will like his voice. It doesn't really matter. I kind of grew to kind of accept that, and I think it sounds better him singing like that. There's a lot of Queen moments, from the Brian May guitar sounds to just the vocal arrangements on some of the harmonies on some of these are just through the roof. But they're just an undiscovered band that's went into obscurity and found a very teeny cult following. People that get into Apes and Androids totally do enjoy them, and their influence from some of the albums that were on this list, whether it was direct or maybe just similarities, like Eldrin, for example, or Pepe Deluxe, I totally always notice. And this, to me, is like the sort of blue chip standard of that style and of this whole style in a lot of ways. I mean, does it kind of cross over to the Mars Volta and Oceansize as much? No, it's not as heavy and maybe even as guitar driven. It's more synth and keyboard driven, although there's still a lot of guitar on here. But Radio's another one I didn't even mention. There's humor on this. I mentioned Self, the connections to Self. There's just so much, and I love Call Florence Power. I love the EP that Brian Jacobs produced from Cale Parks the year after, which is just, of course, just all the stuff that's come out. I owe a ton to this album, and I never got to see them live, unfortunately. They'll probably never do a reunion, but who knows? But we have the album to enjoy, and I don't know, writing novels or short stories based on albums, something I've always wanted to do. This for the River Empire or something else. Maybe I'll try doing it someday. Anyway, that is the number one top of the mountain album for this style. Maybe someday, if something changes, big dramatic changes, or I'll do a redux. Like I said, I want to do an artist list, which will include obviously many of the names I've talked about. It might be a little bit of rehash but thank you for watching. If you found in these videos, I know some of them have been pretty long, but this is something, as I wrote here, this is kind of my holy Bible of rock music this century. Admittedly, it's a long, bloated list with many artists, with several albums, each included, but still warranted for me. This really is my shit, and I feel like one of the only people who champions this hybrid of styles that connect through being progressive or artsy with modern rock, pop, folk, electronic, post, math, chamber, music, etc. Certainly, it's not a definitive list, but it is the best I can do for now without overthinking and for countless more hours, days, weeks, months, or even years. It's going to be, okay. Part of it, like I mentioned when I started this, is that I want to do this now because I'm not, who knows if I'll ever have the chance to write a book about it or whatever. I could post some stuff in the blog about it. When you're turned 46 years old and, life hits you and you struggle with things, you kind of wonder, well, I don't want to not be able to do something before it's too late. So that's why I'm trying to kind of escalate stuff here. Maybe I'm overreacting, and panicking a little bit, but I really don't care. And I don't care how many people find this to be truth. I hope people do, but if people do not, at least I left it, maybe people discover this 20 years from now. I don't know. But anyway, thank you for watching. Like I said, please subscribe if you haven't subscribed yet, and we'll see you next time. Oh, one more thing just to add on to. I wanted to credit a number of people that influenced my ability to find out about a lot of this stuff. One of them being Lorenzo from Alt Prog Core. He wrote a book on kind of this style of music that's all in Italian because he's from Italy. I don't blame him for doing that, but I've always wanted to read this book. I've never actually ordered it. I should just order it, even though maybe I could learn Italian. But yeah, if you change it to English, maybe it would. Let's just see here. Yeah, I mean his taste is very similar to mine, but there he outlines the chapters. So he talks about the Mars Volta, Dredge, the Deer Hunter, Coheed and Cambria, now the Fall of Troy, Circus Survived, Damiera, Biffy Clyro, Oceansize, Area Grom, So, he's one of the only ones, but, this would have been what I would be doing, or maybe someday do something similar. I don't know if I would use the Mars Volta guys as necessarily the cover, but they definitely are sort of the most visible group and probably the most influential like group artist band in this style of music. The other thing was I could sort of just quickly show this is just alphabetical order the College Prague umbrella list I made. Edibisi Shank, Area Grom, The Age of Rockets, Anathallo, Annuals, Antlers, Apes and Androids, The Apex Theory, Apples and Stereo, Appleseed Cast, Archive. I mean, it'll take a while to go through, but it's on my Rate Your Music page. I'm going to link this and the actual list. I just went through all 13 of these videos. This is the 13th video. But yeah, this was what I did. And this is over 10 years old now. Woven. I don't know I think Designer Codes didn't make it, but if I do a Redux, maybe they will. So anyway, just to put a cap on this, so that's kind of some of the origins of where this came from. But anyway, thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.